To react to the legal questions surrounding the Supreme Court's ruling and COVID restrictions around the U.S., we're joined by attorney and the Cardinal George Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Mary FIORITO. She joins us via Skype from Chicago. Mary, I want to start with what we're seeing happening in California. As of this weekend, indoor services are no longer permitted throughout much of the state, and many other states are looking to tightening restrictions on the number of people allowed to gather indoors or outdoors, including the number of people who attend Mass. What do you make of this, and do you think the Catholic laity will stand for it?
Well, I find it just from a legal point of view very distressing because I believe the bishops have made it very clear, specifically the bishops in California, that they intend to abide by safety standards that exceed what grocery stores are doing, what other public places of accommodation are doing. I know when I go to Mass at my parish here in Chicago, my temperature is taken, contact information is registered. I'm getting hand sanitizer that I must use before I may enter, and then there's extensive cleaning that goes on afterwards. I compare that to going to, say, my local Target, where I'm handed a cart that I'm not sure that has been cleaned, and some people are wearing masks and some are not, and no one's temperature is taken. So what the law doesn't like, particularly the First Amendment's free exercise clause doesn't like, is religion being treated in a disproportionate way to other similarly situated organizations or businesses. And it's not as if the church is saying we think that COVID is a hoax, we don't take safety standards seriously. No pastor in his right mind wants to see half of his congregation become ill. It's just sort of an absurdity even to suggest it. However, right. Our rights to worship are protected by the First Amendment. And when state legislatures or governors decide to take upon themselves to legislate for the entire, religious population of the state of California, that really becomes very problematic.
Archbishop Cordileone, as you know, has been very vocal about his position. What about the Bishops' Conference nationally? Should they be responding as a group rather than just a local conference in California or New York?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say on that particular point, Raymond, because the diversity of each state and each conference individually, is really very wide. There's, you can't look at, for example, a diocese or archdiocese in a more rural state like Montana or Nevada and compare that in any way to a far more populous state with a much higher Catholic population, like, say, a New York or a California. So to have the bishops speak in a universal way, I think does present them with practical difficulties because there aren't universal norms that would apply across the board, if that makes sense. You have some rural parishes, like in downstate Illinois, for example, where, 50 might be a maximum they get any Sunday anyway. So, to try
But Mary, I worry we're getting too granular about this and trading rights. The fact is, there is a principle at stake. And the principle is, I have a free exercise to religion. I also can take a risk management assessment for myself and my family. We've been all schooled about COVID. We know the highs and the lows. And the fact is, if young kids can take to the streets and protest, they can take to the streets and go to Mass. I think this should be a preferential option for healthy people and young people. And I worry that not only as a society, but the bishops in particular, are a little reticent to articulate that. And that seems, a missed opportunity. As I discussed with Bill Donahue earlier, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to bar restrictions on religious services in New York that Governor Andrew Cuomo had imposed on churches and synagogues. As an attorney, what effect, if any, do you think that ruling might have on other states where they're either considering tighter restrictions on worship or it's already underway?
Oh, I think it's definitely a warning, and a very clear one, that when crafting whatever new restrictions or regulations that they're planning to attempt to enforce, if religious congregations bring them to the court in the same way that the Diocese of Brooklyn and this particular Orthodox Jewish community did, they will meet with the same result. So they better be very careful in how they are instructing people when and where and why they can or cannot worship. The First Amendment is first for a reason, right? It's the right, your religious rights Your right to exercise your faith in the public square does not vanish because of COVID. Justice
Right.
Samuel Alito gave a terrific speech on this. You can, your
Right.
listeners
Mary,
and viewers can see it.
let's.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, no, well, I'm going to play it. Let me play it for people. I have it queued up here.
Just as the COVID restrictions have highlighted the movement toward rule by experts, litigation about those restrictions has pointed up emerging trends in the assessment of individual rights. This is especially evident with respect to religious liberty. It pains me to say this, but in certain quarters, religious liberty is fast becoming a disfavored right.
Mary, your reaction, is it becoming a disfavored right?
Oh, it already has been in many quarters. I think he is spot on. I mean, if you look at even just outside of these worship cases, Raymond, you look to Masterpiece Cake Shop, you look to the Little Sisters of the Poor. There have been multiple instances where religious freedom is seen as somehow a discriminatory right that religious people have over non-religious people, rather than what it really is, which is the protection of Americans of all faith traditions to be able to practice their faith freely. I mean, there are states in this country, for example, that their Catholic charities can no longer facilitate adoptions. And, before he died, Cardinal George wrote a very beautiful column on this where he said, if you had told me 10 years ago in the United States, the Catholic charities, who for 100 years have been doing adoptions in this archdiocese, would be told that we could no longer do them, I would have told you were crazy. And, it sort of started with social services. We look now, the Little Sisters of the Poor, twice brought to the Supreme Court. Thank goodness the justices had the good sense to rule in their favor, and quite, 7-2, which was not a small majority. But you do see the way in which religious bigotry is creeping in to sort of the national conversation in areas where you would have been shocked by this 20 years ago. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett's hearings for the Seventh Circuit, not so much for her Supreme Court confirmation, but you look at people asking her, are you a Orthodox Catholic? Does the dogma live loudly in you? I mean, things that I was very grateful to see the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish head of the Anti-Defamation League, coming out in her defense saying these questions have no place in a judicial confirmation hearings.
All right. All right. Well, we're seeing the pushback on these religious restrictions, Mary, all over the world. This week in France, the bishops argued and won an appeal against a 30-person mass limit. And in Ireland, a priest refused to close his parish, saying he wasn't aware of, quote, any law against people practicing their religion. He could face up to 6 months in jail. Do you think these COVID restrictions on houses of worship may be awakening people all over the globe to their religious freedoms that perhaps they took for granted?
What it's, I think, proving to people, particularly people who are faithful Catholics, who are well-informed, is how quickly the government has moved to, and not just the government in the United States, but as you mentioned, in France and in Ireland, how quickly the government has moved on religion, as you pointed out as we began the conversation, not a political protest of any kind. And it's really been very sort of, I think, a wake-up call to many people to say, hey, wait a second, who am I hurting? There's 10 of us at Mass in our little rural parish. Why is that wrong? But 80 people can crowd into, say, a marijuana dispensary, and they're not breaking the law at all. You cannot hold separate organizations to separate standards when we're talking about public safety. If it truly is a public health matter, everybody should be held to the same standard. Why are religious groups being singled out in this way?
Yeah, it is curious. I want to move on to another topic. Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron has filed an emergency request with the Supreme Court challenging his Governor Beshear's order keeping religious schools closed. Now, the governor said all schools needed to go back to virtual or distance learning due to COVID cases going up. A 3-judge circuit court panel ruled against Cameron. In a press release, A.G. Cameron said, Kentuckians have a First Amendment right to exercise their faith through a religious education, and we maintain that the governor is clearly infringing upon that right by closing religious schools. The U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled that religious institutions cannot be treated different than secular activities, and we are asking the court to simply apply the same analysis to the governor's disparate treatment of religious schools and other secular activities. Your thoughts on this? Does religious education enjoy the same protections as religious worship and other religious expressions?
Well, absolutely it does. Cardinal George, to quote him again, had a very sort of frequent saying, which is Catholic schools exist to teach Catholic children the Catholic faith. The same for Jewish day schools and evangelical Christian schools and Missouri Synod Lutheran schools, all of which have a very faith-based approach to their education. But even going beyond that, just to sort of use some good old-fashioned common sense, we know a lot more about COVID than we did 9 months ago. We know now children contract it at a far lower rate. We know that mitigating factors really do help prevent the spread of the virus. I know at my daughter's grade school, she sits 6 feet apart from the person at the same table. They all wear masks. They all have their temperatures taken every morning. Religious schools have really gone above and beyond, like our churches have, to make sure that we're not putting anyone else in danger and we're not putting ourselves in danger.
Lastly, I want to get your reaction to a tweet that was posted on Twitter regarding Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Barrett joined the majority of the court in allowing the government to proceed with an execution of a person named Orlando Hull. Now, Hull was sentenced to death for his role in kidnapping, raping, and murdering a 16-year-old, Lisa Renee, in 1994. Father James Martin tweeted this out about Barrett's Catholicism vis-a-vis this death penalty case. He said, "This means that Amy Coney Barrett, in defiance of Catholic pro-life teaching, has voted to execute someone. The death penalty is, as the Catechism says clearly, inadmissible. Every life is sacred, from the unborn child in the womb to the inmate on death row." Your reaction to this, Mary, and what do you think Martin's trying to do here?
Well, not only is that inaccurate, Judge Barrett did not sentence or condemn a man to death. A jury of his peers did. And as you point out, Raymond, this was a particularly horrific case. You have a young woman, a fairly recent immigrant to the United States, a young woman of color, who was kidnapped, gang raped for 2 days, bludgeoned with a shovel, and then buried alive. Now, I find it very hard to believe. I accept the church's teaching on the death penalty. I am very grateful that Mr. Hall seems to have had a very beautiful conversion experience in prison. However, it's very difficult when a case presents itself to a jury with those kind of details, and the death penalty is something that the jury is supposed to consider. That's a very difficult decision for the jury to make, and I can't imagine, even if the court had remanded it back to the trial level, that the outcome would be any different. This was a very, very difficult case just in terms of facts. Secondly, Father Martin well knows, or he should know, having the level of education that he does, that the Supreme Court didn't rule on the morality of the death penalty. They ruled specifically on 2 issues here. First of all, whether or not the government needed to get a prescription from a doctor in order to use the drugs for the lethal injection. Secondly, they ruled on whether or not certain mitigating factors, such as the fact that Mr. Hall had apparently, at some point in his life, rescued a 3-year-old from drowning, that information was not given to the jury. It was considered irrelevant at the time. Both of those things, clearly the law spoke very specifically about it. Amy Coney Barrett promised, "My Catholic faith will not affect the way that I rule. I will rule according to what the law says," because the judicial ethical codes require that I do that. The judicial canons, insist that I do that. And so she did exactly what she said she was going to do. She ruled according to the canons. I'm sure it was difficult for her. She herself has spoken out against the death penalty, but that really wasn't the issue at bar, if you will. The issue were these 2 very kind of specific appellate issues. Why Father Martin would have tweeted something so inflammatory, but also, frankly, so derogatory and detracting from Amy Coney Barrett's reputation to a group of followers. He has many thousands of followers, as you well know, who may not understand what appellate jurisdiction is at all. And I just was incredibly disappointed. You may have seen I tweeted back to him and asked him if he would retract it and correct it and apologize to Justice Barrett. He has yet to do so, but I just found that such a divisive thing to do at a time when the Catholic community Raymond, as you well know, is so incredibly divided anyway over matters of politics and issues that surround it.
And I dare say Father Martin would be the first to yowl if Amy Coney Barrett or any of the other 5 Catholic jurists were to apply the church teaching to certain other matters, perhaps marriage, life, any number of them. I'm sure he would take great issue and umbrage with. So point taken. You can read Mary Fiorito's columns by visiting the Ethics and Public Policy Center website, eppc.org, or follow her at Mary Fiorito on Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Raymond.